On February 24th, the cold air stung every piece of exposed skin as the crews assembled on the fog-covered runway. The wind carried sharp crystals of frost that clung to jackets, helmets, and the edges of the bomb crates lined neatly beneath the wings. Searchlights stretched across the darkness, revealing the massive shapes of B-24 Liberators waiting like giant steel watchdogs with fire in their bellies. Staff Sergeant Daniel Barrett pulled his parachute harness belt tight across his chest. Fingers stiff inside his gloves, he tugged the leather strap sharply, listening to the buckle click into place with a satisfying metallic snap. The belt always found the perfect spot over his ribs, but tonight he pulled it a notch tighter. Not for comfort, for certainty. A crew chief passed by and slapped the wing of their aircraft. "Sandman's shadow is hungry today," he muttered with a crooked smirk. "Hungry for war, hungry for enemies, hungry for sacrifice if that's what the day demanded." Barrett climbed the ladder into the belly of the bomber, boots making hollow clanks as he moved toward the waist gun position. The interior smelled of hydraulic oil, gun grease, and cold metal. The simplicity of it kept him grounded. Machines didn't lie. Machines didn't pretend to be brave. They just worked until they didn't. He passed the ball turret gunner, a young corporal whose freckles hadn't yet been dulled by fear. The kid's hands shook as he loaded belts of ammunition into the feed trays. Barrett gave him a slight nod and tapped his shoulder. "Keep your eyes open. They don't always scream before they bite." The kid nodded too fast, pretending to understand. Barrett took position beside his .50 caliber Browning machine gun, running a hand along the receiver like calming a restless animal. He leaned forward and looked out the waist window, watching the other planes of their group preparing to leave. The engines coughed smoke into the dark before settling into deep, stable roars. Grant's voice came over the intercom. "Everyone locked in." Barrett tapped his mic. "Right waist ready." One by one, voices echoed through his headset. The engineer, radio operator, navigator, bombardier, tail gunner. Then silence, the kind that only war could summon. The engines powered up, the fuselage rattling like bones in a storm. Sandman's shadow lurched forward, wheels bouncing over cracks as the pilot pushed the throttle. The runway blurred beneath them, then fell away altogether. England disappeared under a blanket of clouds. The cold tightened as they climbed higher. Frost streaked the windows. Barrett connected his oxygen mask and breathed slowly, hearing the hiss of life feeding his lungs. He stared outward, waiting for dawn to reveal whether it would bring hope or just provide enough light for Germans to see what they should kill. The sun finally pierced the horizon, painting the sky gold over the cloud deck. It looked peaceful from above, but war wasn't in the sunlight. It hid in the black smoke, blooming far ahead. Flak, dark blossoms opened in the sky, closer with each second. The plane vibrated violently as the pilot fought to stay in formation. Barrett braced his knees and leaned into the window. Every explosion sounded like a hammer smashing inside his skull. Each black puff sent hot shards of steel tearing through the air around them. One blast rocked the plane so hard, his helmet smacked the glass. "Christ," came Grant's strained voice. "Those guns are awake today." Barrett scanned outside for fighters, because Flak only softened you up before the hunters came. He didn't wait long. "Bandits! Left and high!" the tail gunner yelled. 5 German fighters sliced down from the sun, Messerschmitt Bf-1, O-9s, sleek and deadly. Their cannons flashed quick bursts that glimmered like angry stars. Barrett swung his gun upward, sight tracing the lead fighter. He squeezed the trigger, and the Browning roared with violent rhythm, recoil pounding into his chest. His tracers carved a path that clipped the fighter's wingtip. It peeled away, trailing smoke. He barely had time to track a second target when a new sound cracked through the window. A direct hit. Shrapnel burst through the fuselage near the ball turret, showering sparks and insulation. The kid screamed, a high, panicked sound, but he kept firing, his turret spinning desperately to follow a target, diving beneath them. Another blast slammed into the plane. This one felt different, deeper, closer. Then Barrett felt the punch. Not a bullet, not a fist. Something heavier, faster. His entire body jerked backward as if the plane ripped itself into him. His breath vanished. His vision flared white. He staggered, grabbing the gun mount to stay upright. He looked down. A red-hot shard of flak had buried itself in his harness belt, exactly where his heart was pounding hardest. The leather was torn. The buckle dented inward. Smoke curled from the impact mark. His ribs ached like they'd been hit by a truck. Another inch and his heart would have been blown out the back of his spine. He yanked the jagged metal free and threw it to the floor. It clattered among spent shells. The intercom crackled. "Right waist. Report. Barrett, talk to me." He sucked in a painful breath. Still here. Barely. No time to process survival. Another German plane knifed across his window. Barrett fired a burst, not aimed, just instinct, and the fighter's cockpit flashed red before it vanished below. He pulled the gun to the other side. Fighters everywhere. The sky wasn't sky anymore. It was a cage full of claws and fire. The engineer crawled past, extinguisher in hand, shouting that flames were licking along the starboard wing. He didn't wait for help. He never did. He pushed himself into smoke and flame like a man determined to punch out hell. The plane lost altitude, Grant shouting that Engine 2 was gone. "Hold formation if you can," the radio operator yelled desperately. Formation? They were lucky to still be airborne. Barrett tried to ignore the growing pain in his chest. Each breath stabbed deeper. His hands shook, but he didn't let go of the gun. A fighter charged straight at them, close enough for Barrett to see the pilot's goggles flash. He fired. The fighter disintegrated into a burst of flame and debris. Cheers crackled over the intercom, but died instantly as another explosion hammered the belly. The ball turret stopped moving. Silence from below. Barrett knew what that meant. He swallowed hard, chest burning. "Stay with me," he whispered to no one. England was waiting somewhere beyond the endless grey. "Don't quit," Barrett muttered under his breath, voice trembling into the oxygen mask. "Not now. Not now." His fingers tightened around the belt, the same belt that just slapped death in the face. He wasn't done. Not until every man on this plane got home. The sea emerged below them, an endless sheet of grey that reflected the smoke pouring from the engines. The bomber's altitude dropped faster than the pilot could fight it. Every second they remained airborne felt like stolen time. The nose gunner called out bearings, but his voice wavered as the coastline remained stubbornly distant. The ball turret remained frozen in place. No movement, no response. The kid trapped inside wasn't screaming anymore. Barrett didn't want to think about what that meant. Not yet. Not until they were on the ground, and he could check for himself. The sky demanded all his attention now. Grant's voice came through the intercom, strained but controlled. "We're trailing behind. Escorts are pushing forward. We're on our own for a bit. Stay sharp." Barrett scanned every cloud, waiting for shapes to emerge. His heart beat hard against the bruised ribs beneath the belt. Each breath felt like being stabbed from the inside, but he forced his focus to the windows, sweeping left to right with the barrel of his gun ready. Another flash, and there they were, 2 German fighters, low and fast, using the bomber's blind spots. They swept upward in a coordinated strike, gunfire streaking toward the fuselage. Tracers tore across the metal skin, showering sparks inside the bomber like tiny comets. The engineer shouted in pain, but kept himself upright, instinctively dragging loose cables out of the spreading fire. Barrett twisted the gun too quickly, pain lancing through his chest, but he held onto the weapon and squeezed the trigger. His first burst missed, but the second clipped the fighter's engine cowl. The German pilot pulled away, smoke trailing, but the second fighter continued climbing higher to line up a kill shot. The top turret hammered a long burst upward. The German wing snapped in midair and the plane spiraled down in a widening arc toward the sea. The sky should have felt clearer. It didn't. The warning light for hydraulic pressure flickered and died. Smoke rolled in thicker, and the oxygen tasted like burnt oil. Grant cursed and yanked at the controls, trying to pull the aircraft into a shallow descent to avoid stalling. "Oxygen status," he demanded. The radio operator coughed before responding. "Main systems venting. Backup might last to the channel, maybe not further. Masks stay on," Grant ordered sharply. "If a man passes out, tilt his head back. We're not losing anyone to the air we breathe." The turbulence worsened as they dropped altitude, the bomber bucking like a wild animal resisting the leash. Barrett's knees rattled against the floor as he braced for another strike. Then the flak began again. Smaller bursts from coastal guns, but close enough to feel. Barrett could see the flashes of explosions reflected in the windows. He locked onto a cluster of boats in the distance, tiny dots on the grey water, and prayed they remained far below them. England appeared on the horizon. Not close, but there. Grant steadied out. The radio operator tapped his mic repeatedly, trying to contact the home field, his voice hoarse but hopeful. "This is Sandman's shadow. One engine out, one sputtering. Request emergency priority." Static crackled. Then a voice answered, clipped, professional, blessed. "Priority granted. Field is clearing. Keep altitude if you can." Barrett let a small breath go, the first tiny inhale of relief. But the war wasn't finished with them yet. A lone German fighter appeared behind them. A predator still hungry after the rest had fled. It swooped from cloud cover, lining up a perfect shot at the bomber's tail section. Barrett whipped his gun around, but the angle was too tight. He shouted a warning. The tail gunner fired back immediately, his bullets lacing the sky with streaks of white. The German fired a short, controlled burst. The tail gunner screamed, a sharp, pained sound that filled the radio channel before cutting off abruptly. Barrett's blood froze. "Tail! Report!" Grant barked. No answer. The fighter curved away, coming around for the kill. Barrett's hands trembled around the grips of his Browning. He forced his lungs to expand, oxygen burning as it entered. When the fighter dove again, Barrett anticipated the arc and opened fire early, his tracers climbing like angry meteors. They struck the cockpit, smashing through glass. The pilot's body jerked violently and the plane pitched sideways, clipping the edge of the horizontal stabilizer as it spun toward the waves. The bomber lurched from the collision. Alarm screamed. The engineer shouted that the right stabilizer was badly damaged. Barrett didn't cheer. He turned slowly toward the tail section, knowing exactly what he would find. The gunner slumped forward, head down, the harness belt that held him in place now stained darker than the shadowed steel around him. There was no movement, no voice, just the stillness that followed violence. Barrett swallowed hard and looked away. He couldn't let grief freeze his hands. Not yet. Grant pushed the last functioning engines to their limits. The airfield began to take shape. A strip of mud and concrete carved into the English countryside. But the bomber was losing altitude too quickly. Danny felt the aircraft dropping beneath him, his stomach rising as gravity tried to claim them back to the sea. We're going in hot, the pilot warned. Brace. Brace for landing. Barrett locked his stance, gripping whatever he could as the plane flattened out barely above the ground. Wheels struck earth with a brutal slam. The bomber bounced, metal screeching in a violent protest. The engineer cursed when a strut gave out, the wing dipping dangerously low. The belly scraped sparks along the runway as they skidded, yawing left, slamming to a halt with a deep groan of stressed metal. Silence followed, the most welcome silence Barrett had ever known. Barrett's hands loosened from the gun slowly, like prying open claws. He took a few shallow breaths, each one caught on something sharp inside his chest, then unlatched his harness. He dropped to the floor, knees buckling beneath him. The belt, torn and burned, hung around him like a survivor's medal. The crew climbed out through the waste hatch. Soldiers and medics rushed the scene. Barrett stumbled after them, head light, legs unsteady. On the field, he turned back to look at the bomber, smoke rising in gentle curls. Ground crews moved through the broken metal, careful with the fallen tail gunner. The medic placed a blanket over him. Barrett removed his helmet and bowed his head, grief pressing against him like another flak burst. Grant appeared and clasped Barrett's shoulder. "You got us home," he said, voice rough. "Don't ever forget that." Barrett nodded once. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt lucky, painfully lucky. But lucky still meant alive. Medics led him toward the medical truck. His legs almost failed him halfway there, but he held onto the belt like a lifeline. Inside the truck, a nurse cut his chest gear open to inspect the damage. Her eyes widened at the deep bruise forming around his sternum. "That would have killed you," she whispered. "That belt saved your heart." Barrett didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could do was stare at the torn leather in his hands, tracing the edge where metal had tried, and failed, to end him. The war wasn't finished. There would be more missions, more fear, more losses. But for now, he was alive, and he owed that life to a strip of leather and stubbornness. The medical tent was warm enough to sting. After hours in hard air and colder water, heat felt like a betrayal. Barrett sat on the edge of the cot, while the nurse peeled back bandage tape with careful fingers. The bruise on his chest had ripened into a dark, brutal halo. She touched it once, and he hissed, then steadied, jaw clamped until the tremor left his mouth. "You're breathing," she said, more to herself than to him. "That's what matters." He glanced at the harness belt coiled beside him like an animal resting after a fight. The leather was ripped in a crescent where the shard had entered, the buckle mashed slightly flat. In the metal dent, he could see a warped reflection of his own face, grey around the eyes, older than he'd been this morning. The canvas flapped as a wind gust pushed across the airfield. Through the doorway, he could see ground crews swarming the wounded bomber, moving with a grim efficiency that bordered on tenderness. A chaplain walked past carrying a small wooden box. He didn't look left or right, just down, steps measured, mouth a thin line. Grant appeared, cheeks chapped and raw, helmet tucked under his arm. He stopped short of the cot and stood like a man uncertain which words wouldn't break him. "The kid in the ball," he said quietly. "We got him out." He left the rest unsaid. The rest didn't need saying. Barrett nodded. The motion felt heavier than it should. "Cole's spot?" "Gone fast," Grant replied. His eyes were glassy, not from tears, but from the way a man's body tries to protect his heart by making everything far away. He did his job to the last second. Barrett reached for the belt, laying his palm flat on it. The leather was cold. It warmed under his hand. He thought of the moment the shard struck and stopped, all the future that had almost disappeared in one soundless instant. He felt a thin, bitter laugh scratch the back of his throat and forced it down. Grant sat, elbows on his knees. "You want a cigarette?" "I want silence," Barrett said, then shrugged. "And a cigarette." They shared one. Smoke rose in small, guilty columns. The nurse gave them a look and decided to let the living have whatever they wanted for 5 minutes. "Debrief in 20, Grant said finally. "You able?" "I'll walk," Barrett said. "Might not stand pretty." "Pretty's been cancelled for the duration," Grant said, a heartbeat of humor flashing and dying. They crossed the field together, leaving footprints in the grit. The bomber squatted with one gear leg splayed, oil pooling under the nacelle. A crew chief ran a palm along a ragged tear in the fuselage and whispered something private to the metal. Men spoke to planes when they didn't have words for each other. Inside the debrief room, it smelled like damp wool and hot coffee. Someone had pinned a wide map across a board. Grease pencil circles marked the target, the approach lanes, the turnoff. Red string still clung to the thumbtacks, like a line of blood trying to remember where it had bled. The intelligence officer asked questions gently, the way a doctor touches a wound through cloth. Altitude on approach, flak batteries seen, fighter types. Did you observe secondary fires at the target? Did you see it burn? Did you see it not burn? Men answered in short sentences that sounded like they'd been rehearsed, even though they hadn't. The truth was cleaner when you didn't add anything to it. Barrett spoke when asked. He described the fighter that came in too hot and paid for it. He described the one that did not. He described the oxygen line failure and the heat in the wing root and the smell when hydraulic fluid scorches. He did not describe fear. The room already knew what that smelled like. A clerk at the back typed with steady rhythm. Keys clicked. Lives became lines. When it finished, the officer nodded in a way that meant both thank you and you may go. Outside, the sky had shifted from iron to tin. Low light made the whole world look like it wore the same uniform. Men moved with the fatigue of people whose bodies have more memory than their minds. A truck rattled past bearing wing panels wrapped in canvas shrouds. Another carried ammunition crates with chalked letters that claimed they were soap. Barrett drifted toward the hangar, where the wounded were wheeled between tents. The radio operator sat on a crate with his head bowed over his hands, knuckles white around a set of dog tags that weren't his. He didn't look up when Barrett approached. Barrett didn't speak. He sat beside him and stared at the ground until the sound of the operator's breathing steadied. "You got him a message?" Barrett asked when it felt right to ask something. "I told his mother the sky was quick," the operator said. "Told her he never knew." "I think that's true." Barrett nodded. Truth was a mercy you gave when you could. Kindness was what you built when truth wasn't enough. They sat until the shadows turned long, then longer. Men began to gather near the far end of the field, where a small makeshift altar stood under a drab tarp. 2 helmets sat on it, visors down. A folded flag lay between them like a mountain shadow. The chaplain spoke without pretense. No thunder, no poetry. He said the names. He said them cleanly, as if names are the only things that death cannot smudge. A violin could have made it bearable. There was no violin. The silence afterward let the names ring a little longer. Barrett stood at the edge of the group, hands at his sides, belt buckled under his coat like a secret. He thought of the kid in the ball turret smiling too fast, promising he'd be steady. He thought of the tail gunner's last burst ripping the air, a door slamming in a storm. He thought of the moment the ocean became ceiling and floor and everywhere. When the men drifted away, he stayed. The chaplain stayed too. "You want to say something?" the chaplain asked, voice plain, not fishing. "I want to say nothing," Barrett said, "and I want it to be enough." The chaplain nodded like he had already heard that answer 100 times and kept a space for it each day. The mess hall served stew that could have been anything and bread that was definitely bread. The conversation was low, stumbling. Somebody told a joke about a ground crewman who painted a shark mouth on a Liberator because he thought the planes were tired of being pretty. Somebody laughed because the sound reminded them their throat still worked. Barrett ate mechanically until the spoon's scraping made his ribs complain. He pushed the tray away and leaned back. The belt dug a dull, steady ache into the bruise. He touched the leather with the back of his knuckles, as if to warn it not to go anywhere while he wasn't looking. Grant slid into the bench across from him with 2 tin cups of coffee that smelled like yesterday's boots. "Medical's putting you down for 48, he said. "Ribs." Barrett shrugged. "I've flown with worse." "I know," Grant said. "That's why it's 48. He took a careful sip and grimaced. "You keeping that thing on while you sleep?" Barrett glanced at the belt. "If I could sew it into my skin, I would." Grant thought about that longer than a joke needed thinking. "Some days I think the only things that know what we're doing are the belts and the guns," he said. "Everything else is pretending." "Planes know," Barrett said. "Planes know," Grant agreed. "They just don't talk about it." A runner from operations stuck his head through the door and called for a list of names. Not theirs tonight. Barrett exhaled a breath he didn't know he was saving. He left the mess and walked the perimeter until the stars began to form their cautious constellations. He stopped where the field dropped toward a shallow ditch. Beyond it, the land rolled in soft humps toward a black line of hedges. He could not see the sea from here, but he could smell it. A damp iron scent threaded through the colder air. He closed his eyes and listened. For engines, for sirens, for anything that said the sky still had teeth. He heard only canvas ripple and a truck door slam and a laugh with a crack in it. Back in the tent, the nurse had placed his harness on the footlocker. He picked it up and settled it across his lap, like a weight he was choosing. He traced the seam where a previous tear had been stitched with thick thread, the doctor's quick handwork now a permanent scar in the grain. He imagined the moment the shard struck, the leather taking what his heart could not. The belt did not remember that moment. He did. He lay down without unbuckling. The cot protested with a tired spring. Sleep came in ragged increments, a bad film stuttering on a projector. He woke twice, gasping at sounds that turned out to be silence. Each time he pressed a palm to the belt and counted breaths until the numbers steadied. At dawn, a horn sounded, and the field began its ritual again. The endless hangars coughed planes onto hard stand. Crewmen rolled bombs under wings with a stubborn gentleness. Someone somewhere complained about the coffee's courage. The world turned on gears that did not care about what had been lost to make them move. Barrett swung his legs off the cot and sat up carefully. Pain announced itself and then settled. He stood and cinched the belt 1 notch tighter with a click that sounded like direction. He made himself walk to the bomber, not to fly, not yet, to look. The aircraft waited under a grey tarp that made it look like a sleeping animal. A ground crewman lifted the edge so Barrett could duck beneath. Inside it smelled of damp metal and the sour ghost of burned hydraulic fluid. He ran his fingers along the ragged edge of a hole and felt the burr catch his glove. He placed a palm on the cold frame and held it long enough that the warmth from his skin might have left a trace. He whispered a thanks he would not repeat out loud. "Doctor, clear you?" the crew chief asked not unkindly. "Not yet," Barrett said. "Plane's the same," the chief replied. "Wants you back when you are." Barrett nodded, stepped out, blinked against the thin mist that had started while he was under the tarp. The airfield blurred slightly, as if the world needed time to focus after what had happened. Near the operations shack, a bulletin board held a sheet of paper with names and status mark. Across from it, a smaller board held letters, some stamped, some folded back open, all waiting for hands that might never come claim them. Barrett read none of it. He let the existence of both boards be the prayer they were, the war promising to remember in two directions at once. The chaplain caught up to him and matched his stride. "I'm supposed to ask how you're sleeping," the chaplain said. "Then I'm supposed to tell you that you're sleeping fine." "I'm sleeping like a man who keeps forgetting he's not still falling," Barrett said. "That's fine," the chaplain said. "It sounds honest." They walked until the path ran out. The chaplain cleared his throat. "We're putting the kids' photos in a box," he said. "You want to add anything?" Barrett unbuckled the belt, thumb rubbing the dent once. He thought of placing it in that box. He thought of how cold he would feel without it. He shook his head. "Give him the shard," he said. "The one that hit me. If it doesn't spook his mother." "It'll tell her the sky missed on purpose," the chaplain said. "I'll take care of it." They parted without a goodbye. Goodbyes were for trains and shore leaves. Here you said see you, and you let the air carry the hope on its back. By late morning, the medical officer signed a paper that said Barrett would not fly for 2 days if he could help it, and would fly this afternoon if he had to. The paper felt like a hat in the rain, useful only until the storm remembered who it was. He didn't have to fly. Not today. The roster spared him by some cruel arithmetic that kept adding and subtracting men from a ledger no one could balance. He used the hours to clean his gun. He laid each piece out on a cloth like a surgeon setting instruments. The ritual steadied him in a way sleep could not. Metal in, oil there, spring tension corrected, feed tray checked. When he reassembled it, the click at the end sang its small, perfect note. He could have sworn the belt on his lap hummed back. In the afternoon, the clouds lifted enough that the line of the sea drew itself in a dull silver stroke. Barrett walked to the edge of the field again and stood with hands in his pockets, the belt's buckle a gentle weight against the bruise it had given and saved. A gust pushed the smell of salt against his face, and for an instant, the roar of yesterday's ditching rose out of memory so sharp he tasted brine. He swallowed it, breathed until the air calmed. He talked then, softly, to no one listening. He said the names. He said them in the exact order he remembered hearing them over the intercoms. He said them like doorways. He said them like keys. When he was done, he was not better, but he was closer to something that might let him fly again without the sky thinking he'd forgotten how it treats men. He turned back toward the tents. Somewhere, an engine coughed to life and found its rhythm. Somewhere, a wrench dropped and clanged, and someone laughed at the clumsiness of hands that could still hold. He touched the belt, gave it one last notch of attention, and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. They had left together this morning, all of them. They were fewer now. The war had reached out and taken its portion. It would reach again tomorrow, and the day after, and as long as men kept rising into its reach. But today, despite all the math, he had a chest that could rise and fall. He had a strip of leather that had done impossible work and might do it again. He had a plane that still wanted an argument with gravity. And he had a job. He began walking faster, ribs knitting pain into purpose. Breath hissed through teeth that were deciding to be brave. The belt's tongue clicked faintly as it settled against him, and he let the sound be the only word he needed. He was ready to go back when called. He would not be late. He would not forget the names. He would not loosen the belt. The sky was different that evening. It wasn't less cold or less dangerous. The war didn't offer gifts like that. But it had changed just enough for men to notice. Maybe because they had survived it once more. Maybe because a belt had stolen one victory back from death and given it to them instead. Barrett sat outside the tent with his back against a fuel drum, watching the runway lights flicker on one by one. The sound of marching boots and distant engines layered into a rhythm that made the airfield feel alive. It was a strange comfort. Life continued, whether or not anyone asked permission. A jeep rolled up near the medical station and stopped. 2 medics unloaded a stretcher draped with a blanket. There was no hurry, no panic. The worst had already decided itself. Barrett lowered his eyes out of respect. He didn't need to see which crew they were. He already knew they were family. The radio operator found him and sat nearby, knees drawn up, arms locked tight around his legs. "They say we hit the target pretty good," he murmured. "Good," Barrett answered. The word tasted like ash. The radio operator stared ahead, pupils not quite focused on anything real. "I thought we'd all die in the water yesterday." Barrett tilted his head back and looked up. The sky was darkening in soft gradients. A single star winked through the blue-black. Sometimes death flies the wing, sometimes he overshoots the landing. The operator didn't laugh. He wasn't ready. Instead, he asked, "Why'd you take the shard out?" Barrett didn't answer right away. "Didn't want it to finish the job," he finally said. "Didn't want it close." The operator nodded like he understood perfectly. A small crowd had gathered on the tarmac, crewmen and flight officers standing in a loose formation around the battered bomber. Someone had brought a crate of beer bottles and passed them around, clinking glass not to celebrate, but because the sound reminded them that sound still existed. Grant waved Barrett over. "We're toasting her," he said, chin lifting toward the bomber. Barrett joined gladly, though lifting the bottle to his mouth felt like moving a sandbag with broken ribs. The beer was warm, but tasted sharper than any liquor he'd had in weeks. They stood together in a crooked semicircle, facing the aircraft that had refused to die. The Relentless. That name now felt earned, not painted. Grant raised his bottle. The others did the same. "To those who didn't come back," he said. Barrett whispered, "To those who made sure we did." They drank. The bottles emptied fast. The silence afterward stretched just long enough to feel like prayer. The engineer limped toward Barrett, a wrench sticking out of his back pocket like a badge. "Got a look at your belt earlier," he said. "Never seen leather tear like that." "It had help," Barrett replied. "That right?" The engineer removed the wrench, turning it in his hand, as if it could be a conductor for truth. "Or maybe that belt's just meaner than the rest of us." Barrett allowed himself a small grin. "We'd all be dead without it." The engineer glanced at the belt with new respect. "Damn thing's a hero." Barrett didn't correct him. He didn't have the heart to say that belts don't choose which bullets they stop. Night settled quietly. Lanterns lit pathways between tents. The smell of diesel fuel lingered like an argument that never ended. Barrett returned to his cot, but instead of laying the belt aside, he folded it under his head like a pillow. He didn't dream that night, not of the sea, not of fire, not of falling, just endless dark silence, the mercy kind. When morning arrived, his ribs ached less than they had any right to. He sat up slowly, touched the bruise, then the belt. Habit now. Ritual soon. The nurse did her checks. Pulse, lungs, pupils. She tightened the wrap across his ribs and frowned when he winced. "You're getting out of that bed too soon." "There's work," Barrett replied. She raised a brow. "And what happens when work crushes that chest in for good?" Barrett held her gaze. "Then the belt better get lucky again." It wasn't a joke, but she shook her head and left with the hint of a smirk anyway. Outside, the runway glistened with morning dew. Barrett walked toward the rising sun, each step slow but determined. He paused beside a row of jeeps and breathed the cold into his lungs until it warmed there. Grant approached, hands jammed in his pockets. "Command wants to talk to you later." "That's so." "Yeah." Word spreads faster than a muster. "Don't say it," Barrett interrupted. "I'd like one part of my life to not be an airplane." Grant huffed a laugh. "Fair." They walked in silence until reaching the bomber. The ground crew had peeled back panels, exposing the wounded ribs of the machine. The interior looked like the remains of something that had barely survived a beating, but also like something itching for revenge. Barrett placed a hand on the belly, palm flat. "You did good," he whispered. Grant leaned into him with a shoulder. "You did better." "Better is relative," Barrett said. "And alive is absolute," Grant countered. The radio operator jogged up, waving a small package. "Mail call," he said, breathless. "Something for you." Barrett took the envelope, turning it over in his hand. No name except his. Inside were 5 photographs, snapshots taken long before Europe had swallowed their days and nights. Him and the crew. Ricks leaning against the turret, Cole giving rabbit ears behind Grant, the engineer dunking his head in a bucket of water, while the radio operator laughed so hard his legs nearly buckled. And in one photo, Danny was buckling the same harness belt, grinning like a kid posing in a costume. His breath caught. He sat on an ammunition crate and held the photo close, pressing it against his chest, where the bruise pulsed just under the bone. Grant looked over silently. No words. Didn't need any. The radio operator cleared his throat like he had swallowed too many words of his own. "I thought we should look at these now," he said, "before the sky takes more." Barrett nodded, jaw tight. "Thanks." The engineer joined them, took one photo reverently like it might break if he breathed too wrong. "We should frame these," he said quietly. "Hang them near the mess. Remind the boys that miracles are possible." Grant clapped him on the back. "Might need a whole wall for that." Barrett slipped the photos into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his heart, where the belt had stopped death from reaching. Later that day, Command called him to the office. The intelligence officer stood behind a desk stacked with reports. A captain signed a paper and handed it over. Barrett scanned the top. "Commendation for valor. Your actions contributed significantly to the safe landing of your crew," the captain said. "On behalf of—" "With respect, sir," Barrett interrupted softly, "we all contributed. Every one of us." The captain paused, then nodded. "Sometimes the heroes are the ones who say that." Barrett signed where they pointed. They offered him 2 weeks' leave. He refused. They tried 1. He refused that too. He would fly again when called. He wouldn't allow the sky to think it had won something from him. The belt stayed with him every step. That evening, the chaplain held a small service by the edge of the airfield. Barrett attended, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. He stood tall, shoulders square, belt cinched, name spoken, silence honored. They walked back in dim light, boots crunching gravel like bones settling. A fresh bomber stood ready for tomorrow. Danny Barrett stood ready too. He touched the belt once more, pressing the dent with his thumb, and whispered the promise he'd make every morning from this day forward. "You'll stay tight. I'll stay alive. Deal." The wind didn't answer. It didn't need to. The answer was already written in leather. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The air in the tent felt too still, as if silence itself was holding its breath. Barrett lay awake with one hand across his chest, the belt beneath his palm like a heartbeat. That wasn't his. The bruise pulsed under the buckle with every inhale, a reminder of how close the world had come to stopping. He finally drifted off sometime after midnight. The dreams that found him weren't nightmares, just fragments, waves slapping against cold metal, the flash of enemy guns behind clouds, and rows of empty cots lined with folded names. Faces blurred, voices echoed, then light, then dark. Revel ripped him out of the thin sleep. Boots laced, jacket zipped, belt tightened, pain accepted, duty resumed. His ribs ached fiercely when he stood, but the doctor cleared him with a warning glare. "Be smarter than the pain," she said. Barrett nodded. He didn't have time to argue. Grant greeted him on the tarmac with a look that was half relief, half disbelief. "You're actually here." "Where else would I be?" "Somewhere with fewer bullets," Grant muttered. Barrett tapped the belt buckle. "I brought enough armor for all of us." Grant shook his head. "As long as that thing doesn't start demanding hazard pay." The crew met at the bomber, crowded beneath a sky thick with morning fog. There was no laughter today, just nods, a few muttered greetings, a shared understanding that every mission after a miracle feels heavier. The ball turret remained empty. The tailgun position was silent. New names hadn't yet been assigned. Command was scrambling. Men were becoming numbers faster than replacements could become men. The chaplain walked by, giving Barrett a brief thumbs up, an unspoken blessing. He moved on to the next crew, and the next, tucking folded hope into each of them like spare ammunition. Barrett paused before climbing aboard. He ran his hand along the fresh patches of aluminum riveted over last mission's wounds. He whispered something private to the metal, a promise of respect between survivors. Sandman's shadow remained grounded for repairs, so today they would fly with another crew while their own bomber healed. Barrett didn't like switching planes. Every aircraft had different moods, different superstitions, different ghosts. But the war didn't wait for comfort. Inside, he took position beside the waist gun. He tested the swivel, the charging handle, the ammo feed, all smooth and cooperative. At least the gun understood him. The engines thundered awake. The bomber lurched forward, gathering speed. Barrett braced against the vibration, ribs protesting the effort. The runway dropped away, and the fog swallowed them. Climbing through cloud felt like tunneling through wet stone. When they burst into sunlight, the world looked too clean for what waited ahead. The formation tightened. Oxygen masks came on. Time stretched into a quiet, dangerous calm. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The war hid below the clouds, building its courage. Then the radio crackled. The lead bomber called corrections. Flak towers spotted ahead. Fighters reported in the distance. Barrett rolled his shoulders, feeling the belt cinch deeper into his ribs. His fingers curled around the grips of the Browning. He waited for the black blossoms. They appeared all at once, blooming in clusters that swallowed the sky. The shock waves rattled the fuselage like angry fists. Shrapnel hissed past, the air filled with invisible teeth. One burst detonated so close that Barrett felt the heat on his cheek despite the mask. His ears rang. For a moment, the world turned white. But the belt held. His ribs held. His heart kept punching against his chest like it refused to be ignored. The bombardier dropped the payload on target, rail depots feeding the war machine. The plane lifted lighter, but the sky grew heavier. Enemy fighters dove into the formation with merciless precision. A blur flashed by the waist window. Yellow nose, black crosses, cannon fire streaking. Barrett swung his gun and squeezed. Tracers arced perfectly, stitching the enemy wing. The fighter peeled off trailing smoke, dropping like a stone into the clouds. Another came in lower, targeting the engines. Barrett led his line and fired. The German fired back at the same time, two silent promises passing in the air. The belt caught part of that promise. A sharp punch struck his chest again. Not as deep as before, but enough to steal his breath. He staggered, teeth clenching to stop a scream. He forced his vision straight, forced his hand steady, forced his finger to pull the trigger until the attacker fell away. He didn't look down at the belt this time, didn't check the damage. If it held once, it would hold again. If it didn't, he wouldn't need to worry about what came next. Grant's voice cut through the chaos. Hold course! Escorts in 30 seconds. The escorts arrived with a roar. Mustangs diving across the formation like hawks protecting their flock. German fighters scattered. The flak thinned. The coast appeared, sharp, dark, welcome, home. The word entered Barrett's thoughts like warm air. Engines strained all the way west. Radio chatter pinged across the formation. Casualty reports, fuel estimates, damage assessments. Every voice sounded 3 miles older than yesterday. England rose from mist. Runways, trucks, windsocks, the promise of ground. Grant's voice again. Wheels down. Stay ready for anything. Barrett braced, one hand gripping overhead structure, the other still on the gun. The runway met the wheels with a jolt that rattled every bruise on his ribs. Rubber screamed, metal groaned. The bomber slid, shuddered, then slowed and stopped with a deep, collective sigh. The crew didn't move at first. They waited for something else to explode. When nothing did, the breathing returned. Barrett unlatched the belt slowly, gently, like removing a medal from a friend who had earned more than thanks. On the ground, medics approached to triage wounds, but Barrett walked past them, not in defiance, in quiet ownership. Pain was a tax he'd already accepted. He made his way toward the flight office. Grant caught up and walked alongside him, matching his pace. They're calling you the man with the lucky belt, he said. Command wants a photo. I'm not posing with a belt, Barrett muttered. Grant chuckled. Probably wise. War isn't done with us yet. Don't want to jinx the damn thing. Barrett managed a tired smile. It doesn't need attention. It just needs to keep doing what it's doing. They passed the medical tent where cots were filling with the wounded. A priest sat on a crate, head bowed, whispering prayers only the dying could hear. Barrett slowed, eyes caught by a stretcher bearing a familiar jacket. It wasn't the tail gunner, not the turret kid, someone from another crew. But grief moved in the same uniform. It didn't need names to hurt. Barrett removed his cap and held it over his heart. The bruise pulsed under his fingertips. The belt had saved him again. Others weren't so lucky. Survival felt heavy, like responsibility, not reward. Walking away took effort. Thunder rolled overhead, not weather engines. A fresh formation launching into the same fight they had barely escaped. Barrett stopped and watched them climb, black silhouettes cutting into clouds like signatures on a contract no one had agreed to sign. He felt the belt still warm from his body. He touched the torn leather lightly, whispering, not thanks this time, but a promise. One more day. For them. Always for them. Evening crept slowly. Men drank quietly at the canteen. Some played cards, latching onto distraction like a rope. Barrett sat on his cot, cleaning the belt with careful strokes of a rag, removing blood he hadn't noticed earlier. Someone's blood. Maybe his. Maybe not. He ran a finger along the dent in the buckle and marveled at the stubbornness of survival. The war had fired 2 direct shots at his heart. Both times, a strip of leather had stepped in front. His ribs would heal. His spirit would too, but not quickly. The bruise would fade. The fear might not. But fear could walk beside him as long as courage kept the front seat. He lay back, hands resting on the belt across his chest. The canvas roof above him fluttered with a rhythm that reminded him of a bomber's wings riding air. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another day the sky demanded payment. Tomorrow, he would climb into a bomber again. Tomorrow, he would fasten the belt tight. Because death had tried twice and failed. And Danny Barrett wasn't finished yet. As long as breath stayed in his chest and leather stayed between him and fate, he would fly.